3 bullets went into a 23-year-old waitress on a rainy Thursday night in Boston, and not a single one of them was meant for her. The woman bleeding out on the black and white linoleum of the Harbor Light Diner had $46 in her checking account, a mother on dialysis, and a sister halfway through her freshman year at Boston University. She had no reason on this earth to throw herself in front of an old man she barely knew, but she did it anyway, and before the surgeon had even closed her last wound, the most feared man in New England had put his family's ring on her finger. Let me tell you how it happened. The Harbor Light Diner sat tucked into a narrow street 3 blocks from the Charlestown waterfront, the kind of place that hadn't changed its menu since 1987 and was proud of it. Tamsin Ward had worked the Thursday night shift there for 2 years. She knew the booths by their squeaks, knew which coffee mugs held heat and which ones went cold in under 4 minutes, and she knew, without anyone ever telling her directly, that the white-haired gentleman who arrived every Thursday at precisely 9:15 was not a man whose table you kept waiting. Edmund Dre was 79 years old. He came in alone, always, wearing a pressed flannel shirt and a dark wool cap he'd fold neatly on the seat beside him. He ordered the same thing every week: clam chowder, a buttered roll, and a pot of decaf. He tipped 40% without fail. The other staff gave him space and walked carefully around his table. Tamsin just called him Mr. Eddie and brought him extra crackers without being asked. "How's your mother this week, sweetheart?" he asked her one night, 3 months in, when she'd come in with dark circles she hadn't quite managed to cover. She'd blinked at him, surprised he remembered. "Rough week," she'd admitted. "The dialysis schedule got moved and she's exhausted." He'd pressed her hand once, just briefly, with the papery warmth of a man who had seen a great deal of hard life. "You're a good daughter," he'd said. "Good daughters don't go unrewarded." She hadn't thought much about that at the time. What Tamsin knew about the Dre name could fit in a sentence. They ran things in this part of Boston, had for 3 generations, and you didn't ask questions about them. What she didn't know was that Edmund Dre was the patriarch of the most powerful Irish-American syndicate on the eastern seaboard, and that his son, Cormac Dre, 39 years old, with ice water in his veins and a reputation that had made grown men walk out of negotiations rather than sit across from him, had inherited the entire operation while Edmund was still alive and still insisted on eating his chowder alone on Thursday nights like a civilian. Edmund said it kept him humble. His security team said it was going to give them all heart attacks. On the night everything changed, it was raining hard off the harbor. Edmund arrived at 9:16, 1 minute late, shaking droplets from his wool cap. His single bodyguard, a man named Flynn, stationed himself outside under the awning as usual. Tamsin brought the chowder before Edmund even settled in. At 9:47, 2 men came through the front door. Tamsin noticed them immediately, the way you notice something that doesn't fit. They wore dark jackets too heavy for the indoor warmth, and they didn't look at the menu board. They looked at the room. She was moving toward the back counter with an empty coffee pot when she followed the line of their gaze straight to the corner booth, where Edmund sat with his spoon halfway to his mouth. One of the men reached into his jacket. Later, Tamsin would try to explain what happened next. She would tell the detective, then the doctors, then Cormac himself, that she hadn't made a decision. There was no calculation, no courage in the heroic sense. It was pure, stupid animal instinct, the same part of the brain that makes you grab a child before a car hits them without ever knowing you moved. She was already running when the gun came up. "Get down," she screamed, and she threw the full weight of herself across Edmund Dre's table. The first bullet caught her in the left shoulder. The second tore through the right side of her abdomen. The third buried itself into her hip as she and the old man went down together in a crash of dishes, hot coffee, and the awful wet sound of a woman absorbing what wasn't meant for her. The 2 gunmen were already backing toward the door, firing blind to keep the other patrons down. Flynn burst in from the street too late, weapon drawn, and they were gone into the rain before he could do anything useful. Under the overturned table, Edmund Dre was untouched. He crawled out on his hands and knees, This 79-year-old man who had buried enemies and outlived rivals and watched his city change for half a century. And when he saw Tamsin Ward lying on the floor in a spreading pool of blood, he made a sound that had never come out of him before in his life. No, no, no. He dropped beside her, pressing his folded wool cap against the wound in her stomach with trembling hands. Look at me, sweetheart. Flynn, call my son. Call Cormac right now. Tamsin tried to focus on the old man's face. His eyes were wet. She'd never seen him look frightened before, and that, strangely, was what scared her most. She started. She is safe because of you, Edmund said, his voice breaking on every word. You stay awake. You do not leave me. The darkness came for her anyway. Cormac Dre arrived at the harbor light in 9 minutes flat. He'd driven himself. Something he almost never did, because his security detail was 2 minutes behind him, and he hadn't been willing to wait. He came through the door with his weapon drawn, expecting to find his father in a body bag. Edmund was standing by the window with Flynn, alive and whole, his hands still dark with someone else's blood. Cormac crossed the room in 4 strides and grabbed his father by both shoulders, running his hands over him the way parents do with children after accidents. Where are you hit? Tell me where. I'm not hit, Edmund said. He pointed to the floor. She is. Cormac looked down. The paramedics had arrived by then and were working over a small woman in a diner uniform. Her face was white as the tile beneath her. Her apron, white once, not anymore, had been pushed aside to make room for their hands. She was so still. Something happened in Cormac Dre's chest that he did not have language for. Who is she? He asked. Her name is Tamsin, his father said. She's my waitress. She jumped in front of me. Edmund's voice was steady now, the calm of a man who had survived too much to fall apart in front of his son, but his hands were shaking. She didn't even hesitate, Cormac. She just ran. The next 4 days were the longest of Cormac Dre's professional life, and he had once spent 62 hours negotiating a territorial agreement with 4 families who all wanted him dead. He stayed in Boston. He did not take meetings. He sat in a waiting room on the 3rd floor of Massachusetts General and drank bad coffee and watched his phone. And when the surgeon finally came out and told him that Tamsin Ward had survived, that they'd repaired the internal bleeding, removed all 3 bullets, and that she would recover, he put his face in his hands and sat there for a moment that none of his men would ever mention afterward. It was his mother, Agnes Dre, who said the thing that needed saying. Agnes was 71, silver-haired, sharp as a letter opener, and she had been managing the social architecture of the Dre family for 4 decades. She walked into the waiting room on the 2nd day, took one look at her son's face, and sat down beside him with the directness of a woman who had never in her life bothered with a soft approach. You know what has to happen, she said. I'll put guards on her, around the clock. I'll buy her a house, Money doesn't stop bullets, Agnes said, which was the same thing she'd said when Cormac was 22 and thought financial solutions fixed everything. The burn crew sent men to kill an old man eating chowder in a restaurant. They failed. That girl survived and she can identify faces. To them, that is a problem they will solve the moment your guards look away. You cannot protect a civilian indefinitely, Cormac. Our world doesn't allow it. She's 23, Cormac said flatly. She's a waitress. She was a waitress, Agnes corrected. The moment she took those bullets, she stopped being a civilian. The only question is what she becomes next. She looked at her son steadily. You know the commission's covenant. An elder patriarch dining at a neutral location. That's not protected ground. Your father made a choice to dine without full security, and the rules didn't cover him there. But a wife? She paused. The covenant is absolute. Any man who raises a hand against the Don's wife triggers a response the commission itself cannot block. The Byrnes would hand us the right to erase them entirely. They know this. They would never touch her. Cormac was quiet for a long time. She's going to say no, he said. Agnes almost smiled. Then you'd better be very persuasive. He was not, by nature, a persuasive man. He was a decisive one. But when Cormac walked into room 318 that evening and found Tamsin Ward awake and staring at the ceiling with the careful stillness of someone managing serious pain, He sat down beside her bed and did something he almost never did. He told her the truth. All of it. The Byrne family, the hit, what her survival meant to them, what would happen the moment she went back to her apartment in Somerville and her normal life. He watched the color drain from her face as the reality settled in, and he did not flinch from it, because flinching would not help her. "I have a sister," she said when he finished. Her voice was rough, medicated, exhausted. "Poppy. She's 19 and she's in her first year at BU, and she's working 2 jobs to cover what the financial aid doesn't." "Poppy will finish her degree," Cormac said. "Fully funded. Your mother's medical bills, all of them, gone. Your debts, gone. You will have a home, a staff, and security that nothing on this earth gets through." Tamsin looked at him for a long moment, with dark eyes that were clearer than they had any right to be after what she'd been through. "And in exchange, I marry a man I've never had a conversation with." "In exchange," Cormac said, "you live." She turned away. She looked at the ceiling. He could see her thinking through it. The apartment, the shifts, the stack of bills on her kitchen table, the sister working doubles, the mother getting weaker. He could see her measuring all of that against the terrifying unknown of what he was offering. "Okay," she said finally. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'll do it." Cormac didn't waste a single minute. Father Michael Shaughnessy had served the Dre family's spiritual needs for 30 years, and he had seen some unusual things in that time. But he would later say quietly to his associate pastor that the Thursday night hospital wedding in room 318 of Massachusetts General was the strangest ceremony he had ever performed, and he had once married a man on a fishing trawler in a nor'easter. Agnes sat in the corner with her rosary. Edmund Dre stood at the foot of the bed using a cane he usually refused to carry, his eyes full and his chin steady. 4 of Cormac's men stood outside the door, and Tamsin lay propped against pillows in a hospital gown, her left arm in a sling, her face pale and still, watching the man she was about to marry stand beside her bed with the stillness of someone who had made his decision and was not revisiting it. When Father Michael asked for the rings, Cormac reached into his jacket pocket and produced a diamond that Tamsin would later describe to her sister as aggressively real. It was an emerald-cut stone in a platinum setting, 3 generations old, pulled from the Dre family vault that afternoon. He took her uninjured hand in both of his. His hands were large, calloused in ways that didn't come from an office job, and warm. "I claim you as mine," he said quietly, sliding the ring onto her finger. He wasn't saying it for the priest or the room. He was saying it to her, and she understood the difference. She repeated it back, her voice shaking. "I pronounce you husband and wife," Father Michael finished, making the sign of the cross with the efficiency of a man who understood the need for speed. Cormac leaned down. He did not kiss her lips. He pressed his mouth to her forehead instead, and he stayed there for a moment that stretched longer than it needed to, breathing in the antiseptic and hospital air and something underneath it that was just her. "No one touches you now," he murmured. "I promise you that." What neither of them knew was that at that exact moment, a hospital orderly named Ronan Hurley was walking into the 3rd-floor stairwell with a burner phone pressed to his ear. Ronan had worked at Mass General for 14 months. He had also been on the Byrne family's payroll for 11 of them. "He married her," Ronan said into the phone, his voice barely above a breath. "Right here, tonight. Yeah, the commission covenant applies now, but she's in room 318 and she can barely move. If you're going to do anything, it has to be tonight." The voice on the other end of the line was calm and very cold. "Cormac thinks he outsmarted us," it said. "Tell your people we're not just here for the girl. We're here to make the Dawn a widower before the ink dries." Cormac Dre had survived 39 years in a world that ate men like breakfast by trusting his instincts absolutely. And his instincts at 1:17 in the morning told him something was wrong. The sound outside the door had changed. The specific rhythm of his men's footsteps, subtle, something no one else would notice, had gone wrong in a way that took him 3 seconds to identify. It was too quiet, and one set of footsteps was missing entirely. He was out of the chair with his Beretta in hand before Tamsin's eyes had fully opened. "Vincent," she started, confused from sleep. My name is Cormac, he said quietly, and you need to be absolutely silent right now. He reached the door just as the handle began its slow, careful rotation. Cormac shot through the door without opening it. The scream from the hallway was immediate and short. Then all the careful silence was over, and there was nothing but chaos. Suppressed automatic weapons tearing through the drywall, the door, the window blind, filling the room with dust and splinters and the sharp smell of burnt powder. Cormac moved like he'd done this in his sleep, because in a way he had. He crossed the room in 2 steps, grabbed the steel bed frame with both hands, and flipped the mattress sideways in one violent motion that sent Tamsin and her IV stand tumbling to the floor behind it. She cried out, her wounds, her stitches, the impact, and his hand came down over her mouth, firm and immediate. I have you, he breathed directly into her ear, his body covering hers, the mattress and frame in front of them. Don't make a sound, I have you. 2 men came through the door. What happened next lasted approximately 11 seconds. Cormac ended it in 8. He left 1 man alive, deliberately, and with a kneecap he would regret losing, and he crouched beside him while the hospital alarms finally began shrieking through the building. Who opened the door for you? Cormac asked. The man told him, and then he told him something else. The voice on the phone that had ordered the hit wasn't from the Byrne family at all. It was Neil Dre, Cormac's own cousin, the man who had spent the last 3 years sitting at his right hand at every family meeting, eating at his table, and apparently deciding that the Byrne crew's ambitions and his own aligned quite neatly. Cormac was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then he stood up, holstered his weapon, and walked back to where Tamsin Ward, Tamsin Dre, was huddled against the wall with plaster dust in her hair and tears cutting clean lines through the grime on her face. He picked her up, not helped her up, picked her up like she was something that belonged in his arms, and carried her out of room 318 and down the corridor past the arriving police and the screaming nurses and the chaos, and didn't put her down until he was standing beside an armored car with her held against his chest. Neil, she heard him say to someone over her head, his voice like gravel, find him. The Dre estate sat on 12 acres in Marblehead, half a mile from where the Atlantic showed its teeth in winter. Tamsin spent 3 weeks in the master suite, which was larger than her entire apartment building, with high ceilings and windows that looked straight out at the water. Dr. Lena Barrow, private, discreet, exceptional, moved into the guest cottage and came twice daily. Poppy Ward visited on the 2nd weekend, wide-eyed and trying to pretend she wasn't terrified, and sat on the edge of the bed holding her sister's hand for 2 hours, and saying very little and meaning everything. Cormac was mostly absent. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, the Byrne crew and the member of his own family who had helped them get close enough to matter. Niall Dre did not disappear in the comfortable way that phrase sometimes implies. His ending was specific and final, and Cormac never spoke of it again. The Byrne outfit took 3 weeks to dismantle. When it was done, Cormac drove himself back to Marblehead for the first time since the hospital. Tamsin was standing at the window when he came in, watching rain move across the surface of the water. She wore a gray cable-knit sweater and her hair was loose, and she looked, for the first time since he'd met her, like a person who had slept. The diamond ring caught what pale light the evening offered. Cormac set down a glass of scotch he had poured and didn't drink. He stood across the room and looked at her. It's over, he said. His voice was different here, in this room, than it was anywhere else, stripped of something. The Byrne crew is finished. Niall has been handled. There is no one left in this city who would look in your direction. Tamsin turned from the window. She had spent 3 weeks doing a great deal of thinking, with nothing to do but heal and watch the sea and wait. She had thought about her old life, the harbor light, the doubles, the bus home at midnight, the stack of bills, the way exhaustion had become so normal she'd forgotten what rested felt like. She had thought about what Cormac Dre had said to her in room 318 when he'd explained the reality of her situation without softening it, because he'd respected her enough not to. She had thought about the way he said, I have you in the dark of that hospital room, and how she had believed him completely. Our arrangement, she said carefully, You paid the debt, you kept your word. She held his gaze. Am I free to go home? The glass in Cormac's hand made a small sound against his palm as his grip tightened. He crossed the room slowly, stopping when he was close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at him. The last of the day's light was doing something to his face that made him look less like the man who ran half of Boston and more like someone who was afraid of her answer. Do you want to go? Just that. Tamsin reached up and pressed her fingers against his jaw. She felt him go very still under her touch. No, she said. I don't think I can go back to who I was before that night. I don't think I want to. She searched his face. I think I belong here. Something broke open in Cormac Dre that he would never entirely be able to explain. The accumulated weight of 3 weeks of war, and 3 years of running everything alone, and one night in a hospital room where he'd realized that the thing he was most afraid of losing had nothing to do with territory or power or the Dre name. He pulled her in and kissed her like a man who had been holding his breath for a month. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a transaction. It was the kind of kiss that rewrites the story of how two people came to be standing in the same room, that turns chaos and blood and desperate circumstances into something that looks, from the right angle, exactly like fate. Tamsin Ward had walked into the Harbor Light Diner on a rainy Thursday night to work a shift and go home to her stack of bills. She had taken 3 bullets meant for a stranger, and she had walked, slowly, painfully, with her sister holding her arm and a diamond ring on her finger, into a life she hadn't known existed. She did not walk out of it. The woman who had $46 in her checking account and a coffee pot in her hand and no reason whatsoever to be brave was gone. What she left behind was Tamsin Dre, untouchable, chosen, the queen of a kingdom she had earned the hard way, in the only currency that world has ever truly respected. Now, do you think Tamsin made the right call? Should she have walked away when she had the chance? Or was staying the only choice that ever made sense? Tell us what you would have done in the comments below. And if this story had you holding your breath, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good romance with some fire in it, and subscribe to Sadie's Romance Library. Because we have more stories just like this one waiting for you.